because I spend most of my life leading science expeditions, and what we're doing there is we're collecting data. And there's nothing worse than coming back from a long expedition where we've all done our very best and realized, we're supposed to have this much data and we've got that much. Is it going to be okay? Or we've overachieved and we've got tons of it. And where is it all going to go? Is it going to make a difference? Well, to help us understand that is my great friend, Jane Francis. Jane Francis is amongst lots of other things, she's the director of the British Antarctic Survey, my spiritual home. So hello, Jane, thanks for joining.
Hi, Paul. It's great to be here.
Oh, it couldn't be better. What did you think of Emily's talk on Dasgupta review?
Oh, fantastic. I think we should all, if everybody sort of was thinking along those lines, we'd be in a different place, wouldn't we?
Wouldn't we ever? And I was so excited to hear, and I remember reading it even the first time, there was a big element on education because we talk about investment in science, the clever way we can redo investments so that they're sustainable, green, blue, nature-based investments and all the rest. But absolutely, we've got to have massive investments in education. That's why learning outside the classroom, nature-based education. So when I saw that education element in there, and then it couldn't be better that I'm following that with my renewed enthusiasm as to why we collect all this field data with Jane Francis, Director of British Antarctic Survey. I worked for the British Antarctic Survey for 12 years. I was the base commander for 10, and I'm still very much associated, and I feel part of that polar British Antarctic Survey community. And Jane's joined us with a talk from forests to ice sheets, and it couldn't be better. So, Jane, over to you, and hopefully we'll have time for some questions at the end.
Okay, let me just share my screen. Oops. Here we go. Window. There we are. So I'm going to talk about biodiversity, but I think biodiversity about Antarctica that I don't think many people in the audience will know about, because I'm going back millions and millions of years in the biodiversity. Of course, this is the Antarctica you know today. It's a continent covered in this wonderful ice sheet. This fantastic satellite image here shows all the ice cover. It's up to 4 kilometers thick. And there's enough fresh water frozen there that if it all melted, and of course, if Antarctica melts, the rest of the world will melt, then global sea levels will rise by about 60 meters. And of course, well, coastlines will shrink, and there's billions of people along the coastlines. So Antarctica is absolutely critical at the moment in understanding its response to climate change. But let's go back. Well, I'm going to go back millions of years so that we can try and look into the future. So the Antarctica that I've just shown you isn't really a very long history for Antarctica. For many, many millions of years, Antarctica was covered with lush forests that grew right to the South Pole. And it's not about ice caps. And so I think we can understand, if we understand how those forests survived and the types of climates of Antarctica in the past, we may be able to understand what our future warm world will look like. So I'm going to Antarctica and show you a few of the fossils that make up this story. So here's Antarctica again. It's not all covered with ice today. There are some sort of mountain tops around here, and there are some islands around the Antarctic Peninsula here that sticks up towards Chile that I'll mention a lot. And we can find fossil leaves like this beautiful fossil I'm showing here, which shows you that for many, many years of its history, millions of years, Antarctica was land area that was covered in forests, and that plant material has been preserved as fossils. Now, when I talk about this, a lot of people say to me, oh, well, Antarctica must have been near the equator then, and it had a tropical climate. But the really key thing to take away from this is that Antarctica, when it was covered in forests, was over the South Pole. So here's what we call a paleogeography map that geologists put together of what the Earth looked like 100 million years ago at the time of the dinosaurs. So I'm sure you can recognize South America and Africa. You can see here India tucked down near Africa. Here's Australia joined to Antarctica, and Antarctica was joined to South America, forming this Gondwana landmass. But the critical thing to take away from this is that Antarctica as a continent, 100 million years ago, time of the dinosaurs, was over the South Pole. And yet there are forests there, so that we know the climate was warm, probably due to high CO2 levels due to tectonic plates moving and volcanic eruptions. And this is what my favourite island in Antarctica looks like, Seymour Island. It just actually is a sea of rock, of actually loose sand. You may be able to make out our campsite over here. And this is ancient deposits of a seaway. And we find some fantastic fossils in here. So I'm holding an ammonite here. And here they are, beautifully preserved. So here's a clam or a bivalve here. And you can see these curly ammonites here. There's a beautiful one down here that was swimming in the seas at the time of the dinosaurs, a bit like a squid-like creature. And here's some snails or gastropods that lived in these seas as well. And we can take bits of the shell and we can we've worked out that the temperature of the ocean water around when these animals lived was about 15 degrees centigrade. So warmth shows up in many ways. Now, I've worked with many artists to try and take that picture that I have of Antarctica from all the data I've collected and try and put it onto a canvas. So this is Robert Nichols, the artist that I've worked with. And here you can see our picture of those seas that I mentioned and all the animals. So here we have a huge mosasaur, the reptile, the dinosaur of the sea, if you like. It's about the size of a big truck, swallowing a primitive shark. In the ocean here, there's some ammonites, look, there's fish. We've got fish fossils in the mud at the bottom. We will have those clams and gastropods. There's a sort of a land dinosaur here that I'll talk about a bit later. There's birds, we have bird fossils, and all sorts in the ocean. So a very diverse fauna in the ocean. Now we've put here a landscape. There was definitely a line of volcanoes up here when these animals were living here, a bit like the Andes. So we've made it look like the Andes. And you can see forests on the Andes. And so the plants and trees that were growing here, when they died, floated out into this ocean. And they're also preserved as fossils, which I'll show you now. So this is a kind of thing we get in those sediments. We get impressions of leaves. So this is what we call a southern beech leaf, Nothofagus, a type of tree that was very common in Antarctica. We get these huge pieces of wood, which represent large forest trees that floated out into the ocean. And then we even get fantastically preserved pollen that tells us something about the plants that grew on Antarctica that we don't find sort of the other remains of. So here's the wood again. Now this is petrified, so it floated out as a waterlogged piece of tree, huge tree actually, dropped into the mud at the bottom of the sea, and then mineral solutions petrified it. So that's now turned to stone. And if I chop that with a diamond tip saw, then you can see on a microscope slide, these fantastic rings, tree rings here. This is all preserved within that wood. Oops. And it just tells me that these trees were very happy growing in Antarctica. They grew seasonally, they had plenty of warmth, plenty of water, and they loved growing in Antarctica. We have these impressions of leaves. So here's a fossil fern on the left-hand side, and it's a tree fern. It's very, very similar to those feathery leaves of the living tree ferns here in New Zealand, and the ones you can buy in your garden centre if you like, and then they die in the frost, but very similar to New Zealand tree ferns. And then here on the left-hand side, you can see this kind of long branch that's petrified within a nodule of rock, but it's all together. You can see the leaf still attached to the branch because that's really hard and waxy, just like the branches on a monkey puzzle tree, which I'm sure you know about, very stiff and waxy, Araucaria araucana. Today, these trees grow in the high Andes of Chile, next to the volcanoes, and I'm sure they would have done the same kind of thing on the Antarctic Peninsula millions of years ago. Now, here's another picture by Bob Nichols. So we sat down and painted this. This was Jodie Howe, PhD student, went to Alexander Island off the Antarctic Peninsula, and she measured the locations of all these different fossils to try and reconstruct this forest. So here on the left-hand side, we've got a ginkgo tree, very common. We've got here a Southern Hemisphere conifer. Here you can recognize monkey puzzle trees, tree ferns here, proper ferns in the undergrowth, some extinct plants that didn't survive very long. a few bits of moss and lichens, but no flowers. So this is 100 million years ago in the Cretaceous period, but no flowers had reached Antarctica yet. But there is an animal in here. I don't know if you can see it because it's well camouflaged, but hiding behind this tree is a dinosaur. So there's the dinosaur that was floating out. So this is a vegetarian, a herbivorous dinosaur. We find the bones and remains of this dinosaur a bit further north on the peninsula and across other places in Gondwana, so it could move around the south. We also find fossil plants, interestingly, as charcoal. So we find here's a beautifully preserved seed here, very small, at less than 1 millimeter. But it's once you burn a piece of fossil plant material, it's really resistant to decay. And there were probably fossil fires from the volcanic eruptions. And some amazing bits of flowers are preserved as those as bits of charcoal. So here's a piece here, it's a scanning electron microscope. It's only about 1 millimeter high, but a specialist expert, Helen Eklund, recognized this as the tiny flowers of this tree here called mountain pepper or Winteraceae family that lives now in Tasmania and New Zealand, but we had that same plant in Antarctica millions of years ago. And in fact, the top row here of pictures are all some of the fossil leaves that we find, and down below are sort of modern equivalents. So we can trace these plant types from the fossil to present day, and many of them then that we find in Antarctica are the ancestors of plants that live in the southern hemisphere today. So if you go to New Zealand, if you go to Tasmania or Patagonia, you can, in the old forests, walk through what would have been the kind of forests that lived in Antarctica at that time. Here's another picture. So this is another artist, James Mackay, and he's drawn a picture 70 million years old. So this is a little bit younger, and flowering plants had evolved by then in Antarctica. So you can see on this right-hand side some pink flowers here, Proteaceae, sort of big waxy flowers that you could find in the southern hemisphere. These big trees here are southern beech, Nothofagus, that came around, that evolved in Antarctica about 70 million years ago. Up in the highlands, we've got our monkey puzzle trees, and we have some flowering plants and some water plants that we find as pollen down here by these ponds. Also in this picture, you'll see dinosaurs. So my American and Argentinian colleagues work on the bones that we find, and they've got here hadrosaurs over here in the background. There's a stegosaur type dinosaur here by the water. There's big sauropods here in the forests here. There's a few avian type dinosaurs here. These are the ones that kind of survived, if you like, at the end of the Cretaceous. And then what have you got here? Some ducks here as well. So we do have ducks bones, fossil ducks in Antarctica. Now, a lot of these dinosaurs died out 66 million years ago, when there was a big meteorite explosion on Earth. But actually, in Antarctica, we don't see much change to the vegetation. The dinosaurs, the true dinosaurs, disappeared, but we still have a few birds that survived. So this picture is another set of artists from American colleagues. So this is after the dinosaurs, that mass extinction event, after the dinosaurs have gone. And the vegetation is the same. So look, here's southern beech, Nothofagus. Here's our monkey puzzle trees. Here's a Winteraceae again. So that carried on through geological time. But different animals now. So no dinosaurs, but we have marsupial possums here climbing the trees. We have these birds, rheas, coniferous birds, look pretty fierce. And then these here, these sort of ungulates, primitive ungulates. I like to think them as primitive llamas or guanacos or something like that. But they lived around in Antarctica just after the dinosaurs died out. So really nice and warm still, lots of forests around, really good high density vegetation, and a very diverse fauna and flora in Antarctica when it was much warmer, even though it was over the South Pole. And then what happened? We begin to see the geological record shows us that carbon dioxide levels were decreasing. There was probably less volcanic activity. We know from the rock record that the continents split apart, and we see the first signs of glacial deposits, the evidence for ice about 40 million years ago. And then what happened was Antarctica was kind of isolated. Tectonic plates moved away, and Antarctica was isolated within this current that you can see here that circulated around Antarctica. And so that stayed cold and really isolated in Antarctica in its kind of icy tomb. And from that time, then the plants disappeared. We get through a tundra phase, but the plants disappeared. And that's when the big ice sheets starting to grow in Antarctica. And so when we think about Antarctica and its ice and the ice sheets now, they do go back about 40 million years in terms of its history. And that's when it all started. And then about 5 million years ago, what I call the Icehouse set in. So that's when the ice really spread across the whole of Antarctica. We lose any sense of the old greenhouse Antarctica, and we then went into the Icehouse. And the Earth itself went through a massive cold phase. So it was about this time that the Arctic too started to cool down, and a lot of biodiversity decreased in the Arctic region, and the ice formed on the Arctic Ocean on the land around the Arctic. And this is when Antarctica really became super cold, and the ice sheets formed right across the continent and right out beyond the edge of the land. And that's what we know today of Antarctica. You know, this icy place, it's really beautiful. I'm sure you know, Paul, it's a fantastic place to work. It has the most amazing scenery and the most amazing atmosphere. But of course, it is warming now, and we do wonder how long this will last. And it's really interesting to think about the biodiversity today. I think there was a talk this morning about the oceans, but Antarctica now, it has really quite a little, very small, certainly on land. There's only a couple of vascular plants, and there's mosses and lichens, of course, but very little actually animal life on the continent itself. It's too cold, just a few mites and springtails. And the only big animal, of course, is the breeding emperor penguin. But if you go to the subantarctic islands, which are a little bit warmer, South Georgia, for example, you'll see a really abundance of life. A lot of it starts with the plankton in the ocean, and then we go up to here in the center, the krill, which are really, really important in the food web around the subantarctic islands, and that feeds the fish, that feeds the seals, the elephant seals, and the whales, and also the albatross, of course, that live on the subantarctic islands. And we have a little bit more diversity of plants on the subantarctic islands. There are grasses and there are proper plants. And in the oceans, even in Antarctica, there are starfish and all kinds of shelly creatures, huge sea spiders that are really very, very well adapted to living in a cold environment. So what's really interesting, I think, about Antarctica is that I've showed you what Antarctica was like millions of years ago. A high biodiversity, really green, really lush, lots of animals on land, but a very different kind of Antarctica now. So the ice world, the ice sheets, and the ice age has brought a very different kind of animal kingdom and plant kingdom to Antarctica. And of course, the big question is, as Antarctica warms, what will happen to that very special Antarctic polar fauna and flora? And are we going back to sort of a much more diverse and green land in the future as the ice melts? And with that, I'll stop sharing and I'll come back to you, Paul.
Wow, Jane, bravo. Thank you very much. I remember one of the great artist projects we had during my time at Rothera was the person doing those great postcards. And the postcards were painted of certain, Jurassic period and earlier. And they were one of the most successful art projects I think we ever did, because people were amazed. I used to love watching them being developed. And then the next season, when I was south, they were hugely popular. We were all talking about it. Everybody was talking about it. Oh, yeah, because we could see that out of the window, or we'd just been in the field with it and come back and say that, particularly people like me who had worked on, say, like Chris Griffiths, my second season in Antarctica. And I remember standing amongst those amazing tree fossils on the peninsula.
Yep.
And him describing, and we were walking around taking tons of measurements with the old Jacob staff, I remember, all angles and directions. And then him describing very eloquently how, I forget, maybe 65 million years ago, this was a great river, and these trees will have collapsed and they've all fallen this way. And even though it was a really foul day, just one of those freezing to death long days, I was completely enraptured. Here was a man painting the picture of what felt like a sort of tropical Antarctica. And what you said, it's funny, isn't it? I suspect you say it regularly, that Antarctica actually hasn't moved. It's always been at the South Pole.
Absolutely. Well, for the last 100 million years, for sure. And people always say to me, oh, well, if it's tropical, they must have, the continent must have been near the equator, but it hasn't. It has been over the South Pole. It still had that strange light regime. It was dark during the winter, and yet the forests survived. So there's another really interesting question about how you get forests surviving close to the South Pole. Even if the climate was warm, how does it survive, with dark winters? And the answer is they did. I mean, dinosaurs can migrate away. They could go perhaps to lower latitudes and get a little bit more light, a little bit more food. But the forests were there. They can't move. So they must have been able to tolerate both dark winters, but also continuous sunlight during the summer. And that would have probably been able to help them grow really lush. The other thing I would like to mention, and I forgot to point it out, but on the picture of the 50 million year old world, when the dinosaurs had gone, 50 million years, we had possums, we had these big new mammals, and on the beach, you couldn't quite see them, are penguins. And when we find all these leaf fossils of the Nothofagus, the southern beach, the Winteraceae, 50 million years ago, the time of the mammals, the climate, again, was really, really warm, but we find many, many penguin bones along with the fossil leaves, and lots of species of penguin. So penguins did not evolve in the cold. They evolved in the tropical rainforests of Antarctica. And from then on, of course, they have actually, most species of penguins have moved north, haven't they? Well, they've moved into lower latitudes, and only a couple have actually stayed and managed to survive in the cold of Antarctica.
I think that's a wonderful story, Jane. It's a bit like music. You hear that and you go, yeah, that's music to my... These are the kind of things that you really want to feel across, to understand what's going on today and make smart decisions. Are you finding it easier or more difficult to get people to listen to your science in regard to making smart decisions?
I think there's the understanding of climate change and the importance of climate change has changed radically, actually, even in the last year or two. I think, I think the global pandemic has really made a lot of people understand that we do live on one planet and we are a global community, and that, that things are changing. And I think it's absolutely fantastic now that there's evidence across the planet that people are understanding that our climate is changing and we're the cause. I mean, everybody can see the climate change, can't they?
Yes, exactly. It's so difficult. It's one of those things. I mean, most of us live in an urban environment, and, it looks probably about the same as it did 20, 30, 50 years ago to be about fair. We have a cold winter or a wet summer or something. It's not until we go to these places that are untouched that we can tell these essential stories and really bring back the evidence. But there was always that thing of bringing back evidence from exotic places like the rainforest or the deserts or the polar regions, and it being a big leap, it seemed, to get people to grasp it, feel it, understand it, and make business and political decisions around it. And it was it's always been a constant sort of battle. But you're right. Absolutely, Jane. I completely agree with you that this COVID-19 pandemic it's the ultimate motivator, isn't it? I mean, it's our health. If we don't get this right, we're in big trouble for the next one.
Yes, and I think people now begin to realize more that the interlinking of health and the environment and the climate, they're all now one big cycle, and we can't tinker with one thing and expect no sort of end result. We've got to be careful with the whole system. Yeah, really important.
First of all, we've had great fun with the economists, the global economists of all kinds, and it's been really wonderful. Again, Jane, it's that thing of I got excited with Emily and the Dasgupta review presentation that we only know all this stuff because of the field work that we're all doing, and that it's the ultimate motivator, isn't it? Get out there and get that data. And that's even more valuable. We'll talk about finance. I mean, it's a wonderful thing, isn't it? And so your data, our data, Antarctic data, must be considered even more trustworthy and more valuable than it ever was, I would think.
Well, I hope so. But I think, what's really interesting, I think, certainly with Antarctica or polar science generally, a few years ago, I think scientists would have gone to Antarctica just to understand what Antarctica was like and the impact of climate change on Antarctica. But I think we've come a step beyond that now, and we're looking at humans that live in the low latitudes have made climate change, and that's affected Antarctica. But now we're going back and we're saying, well, Antarctica is getting its own back, on the humans, and what's happening in Antarctica is having a global effect. So what happens at the polar regions happens first, and in the most extreme way, and then that impacts on where we live. So I think and the biggest question, of course, is sea level rise. But Antarctica will also affect the melting of Antarctica will also affect the ocean circulation, and it will also affect atmospheric circulation and the climate as well. So, yes, we still have got a lot more work to do in Antarctica before we really understand the complexity of it.
Thanks, Jane. And the value of the long-term data sets. Earlier today, I was delighted. We had a live session from Rothera, and Ryan took us through the long-term data set work on the RATS program, and brilliant piece of work. And I mean, I'm biased because I think with a single place on Earth to understand all of the value of a long-term data set and what's going on, on the planet is Antarctica. I still remember when it was Keith who drilled through the Ronnie ice shelf after lots of years of work and put the instruments down that led to the effect of Antarctic bottom water and the effect that has on driving the world's ocean currents and climate. And if only we could bring politicians to stand somewhere on the Ronnie and look at that little thing over the top of it, two drums sort of welded together, which is the cap on it, and understand that hole and the instruments underneath help us understand global ocean currents and climate. These are the kind of stories that should be in every single school and in every politician's front of their brains,
Absolutely. Absolutely.
All right, Jane, look, it was terrific to see. Hopefully next time I see you, it'll be somewhere more exciting than on a laptop, British Antarctic Survey headquarters for a cup of tea, or, in Antarctica on a boat somewhere, or I don't know.
On our new ship, on the Sir David Attenborough new ship. Yes,
I saw your up there. That picture was amazing. Love it. I'll be there soon. Thanks again, Jane.
Okay, thanks very much.
Thanks so much for joining.